car fixed yet? It's the Studebaker. Yeah, the one with the little doggy and...
On a Saturday night in February 1977, a television crew that had spent 10 years making America laugh sat in near total silence. The cameras were still rolling. The studio audience, the same crowd that usually roared on cue, had gone quiet too. Carol Burnett was standing in a cheap floral dress under hot studio lights, playing a woman named Eunice who believed, with her whole heart, that singing on a third-rate talent show was finally going to change her life. And then the judges laughed at her. Not the audience. The judges, inside the sketch. On camera. The episode aired exactly once in its original form. It won praise from critics almost immediately. It's still talked about by television historians as one of the most emotionally devastating 5 minutes ever filmed for a variety show. And yet, by Carol Burnett's own account over the years, it's an episode she's never been entirely comfortable sitting through again. Not because it was bad. Because it was too close to true. Before we get into exactly what happened on that set and why it's haunted her for almost 5 decades, if you're new here, this is exactly the kind of story we dig into every week, the real moments behind the entertainers everyone thinks they already know. So if that sounds like your thing, go ahead and hit subscribe, drop a like on this video, and tell us in the comments which classic TV moment still gets you, even decades later. It genuinely helps us keep making these. Now, let's get into it.to understand why that one sketch landed so hard. You have to go back to where Carol Burnett actually came from, because almost nothing about her childhood matched the bright, confident woman millions of people grew to love. She was born in San Antonio, Texas, in 1933, into a home that was unstable from the very start. Both of her parents struggled with alcoholism, and neither one was able to give her anything resembling a stable upbringing. Her father drifted between jobs. Her mother wasn't emotionally present. By the time Carol was barely old enough to form memories, she had already absorbed a hard lesson most children never have to learn that young, that the people who are supposed to show up for you sometimes simply don't. When her parents could no longer raise her, Carol's grandmother stepped in and took her to Hollywood, hoping for a fresh start. What they found instead was a single cramped room in a run-down boarding house, shared with a building full of people just barely holding their lives together. Money was almost non-existent. They survived on a few dollars a week, which meant skipping meals, patching clothes, and finding creative ways to get by. But in the middle of all that scarcity, Carol's grandmother gave her something she had never reliably had before: steady, unconditional love. It wasn't a comfortable childhood. It wasn't an easy one. But for the first time, it was a safe one. Out of that loneliness, young Carol built her own form of escape. She invented an imaginary twin sister, a more confident, more glamorous version of herself, and she played the part so convincingly that grown adults in that boarding house genuinely believed the sister was real. It's a strange, almost eerie detail when you think about it, a little girl so good at performing joy that she could fool grown adults desperate for something joyful to believe in. Every Saturday, she and her grandmother would scrape together enough coins for movie tickets, and for a couple of hours, Carol would disappear into a world where everything sparkled, where people were beautiful and dramatic and larger than life. Then the lights would come up, and she'd walk back out into a life where they sometimes couldn't even afford toilet paper. That tension, between the glittering world on screen and the very real hunger waiting at home, never fully left her. It shaped the kind of performer she became, someone who understood instinctively that comedy wasn't the opposite of pain. It was often the only thing standing between a person and their pain. That idea would end up at the center of her entire career, and it's exactly what made one particular sketch, decades later, feel less like comedy and more like something far more personal. Carol's path to stardom wasn't a straight line either. She originally planned to study journalism, partly because it had been her mother's unfulfilled dream, but a single theater elective at UCLA changed everything. For the first time, she felt fully alive on a stage, loud, funny, and completely unashamed of taking up space. She switched her major, a decision that felt enormous for someone who had spent her whole life trying not to need anything from anyone. Not long after, an anonymous donor quietly covered tuition she could afford, no explanation given, no name attached. It wouldn't be the last time a stranger's quiet generosity altered the direction of her life. A few years later, another stranger, a businessman she'd never met before, handed her enough money to move to New York and chase Broadway, on the condition that she never reveal his identity and that she eventually pay it forward to someone else chasing the same impossible dream. She kept that promise for the rest of her life. New York chewed her up for a while. She shared a single bathroom with a house full of other broke, hopeful young actresses, worked odd jobs to cover rent, and got rejected more times than she could count. But persistence paid off in the form of a ridiculous novelty song that somehow became her breakout moment, a deliberately absurd performance that got her booked on the biggest variety programs in the country. From there, the momentum never really stopped. A Tony-nominated Broadway run. A history-making television special with Julie Andrews that almost didn't happen because network executives didn't think two women could carry it. And then, in 1967, the show that would define her. The Carol Burnett Show wasn't supposed to work, at least not according to the conventional wisdom of the time. Variety television was considered a man's format. But for 11 straight seasons, Carol Burnett hosted, starred in, and helped shape one of the most beloved programs in the history of American television, pulling in tens of millions of viewers a week and collecting an almost unbelievable haul of Emmy Awards along the way, more than 24 over the show's run, across writing, performance, and production. It became a launching pad for some of the most talented comedic performers of the era, and it proved, decisively, that a woman could lead a major variety show and make it must-watch television for over a decade straight. Part of what made the show so beloved was its willingness to mix outrageous physical comedy with something a little riskier, real emotional honesty. Nowhere was that more obvious than in the recurring sketches known simply as The Family, built around a working-class household led by a sharp-tongued matriarch and populated by characters whose dreams rarely matched their reality. At the emotional center of those sketches was Eunice, a woman desperate to be seen as special, constantly disappointed by a life that refused to give her anything close to the spotlight she felt she deserved. On the surface, Eunice was comic relief, loud, dramatic, endlessly bickering with her family. But underneath, there was something achingly real about her, a woman who had convinced herself that just one lucky break would finally prove she mattered, and February of 1977, that undercurrent stopped being subtext and became the entire point of the sketch. The premise was simple enough on paper. Eunice gets a shot at appearing on a real, wildly popular but deliberately ridiculous talent competition show of the era, the kind of program built entirely around mocking contestants for entertainment. She rehearses obsessively. She fights with her family over what to wear. She convinces herself this is her moment. And then, in front of a live celebrity judging panel that included a beloved game show host and a recognizable music industry personality, she steps out and sings her heart out, completely sincere, completely vulnerable. And the judges gong her off the stage almost immediately, laughing as they do it. What made the sketch unforgettable wasn't the premise. Shows had built jokes around humiliating talent show contestants before. What made it unforgettable was the choice Carol Burnett made as a performer in that moment. She didn't play it broad. She didn't reach for a punchline to soften the blow. She let the camera sit on Eunice's face as the laughter died down and the reality of what had just happened set in, a woman who had pinned her entire sense of worth on this one shot, watching it evaporate in real time, in front of an audience that found her dream funny rather than admirable. There was no rescue joke at the end. No tidy resolution. Just heartbreak, allowed to sit there, uncomfortable and unresolved, for an audience that had tuned in expecting to laugh. It's the kind of choice that's easy top raise in hindsight and genuinely risky to make in the moment. A comedy show built its entire identity around giving people permission to forget their troubles for half an hour. This sketch did the opposite. It handed people a mirror instead. And the reason it's believed to have stuck with Carol Burnett so deeply, more than almost anything else she filmed across 11 seasons, isn't hard to understand once you know where she came from. Eunice's desperation to be seen as special, her fear of being laughed at instead of taken seriously, her whole identity hanging on the idea that this time, finally, someone would notice her, that wasn't just a character choice. For a woman who grew up stealing toilet paper from movie theater bathrooms and inventing an imaginary twin just to feel less alone, that scene wasn't really about a fictional talent show. It was about every moment in her own life when wanting more than survival felt like a dangerous thing to admit out loud. That's the thread that runs through nearly every account of this particular episode over the years. Carol Burnett has spoken more than once about the philosophy that guided the family sketches, that even at their most dramatic, the goal was always to give audiences somewhere warm to land, not to leave them sitting in real pain. By most accounts, this was the one sketch where that line blurred the most, where the comedy stopped acting as a safety net and the rawness underneath was simply allowed to exist on its own. Critics loved it specifically because it didn't pull its punches. Fans still cited a some of the most quietly devastating moments in the show's 11-year run. And Carol Burnett herself has, by most accounts, treated it differently from the rest of her catalog ever since, less like a beloved bit she's eager to revisit, and more like a moment she's content to let live in people's memories rather than her own living room. The panel sitting in judgment of Eunice that night wasn't made up of random extras either. The judges were played by recognizable faces of the era, including a familiar game show host known for his work on programs built around trivia and charm, and a music industry personality who specialized in exactly this kind of gleeful, theatrical cruelty. The actual competition show they were spoofing was already a cultural phenomenon by 1977, a program that had turned public humiliation into primetime entertainment, where bad acts got literally gonged off stage by a panel that treated rejection as the whole point of the show. Borrowing that format gave the sketch an extra layer of discomfort, because everyone watching at home already knew exactly how merciless that real panel could be. Eunice wasn't just being judged by fictional characters. She was being judged by a format the audience already associated with public embarrassment as entertainment, which made her sincerity even harder to sit through. It's worth pointing out, this isn't a case of a performer being embarrassed by bad work. By every measure that matters, the sketch was a triumph, sharper and more affecting than almost anything else on television that season. The discomfort, if it exists, comes from somewhere different, from how accurately it captured something true about longing and humiliation that Carol Burnett had lived through long before she ever stepped foot on a soundstage. Sometimes the hardest performances to watch back aren't the ones where an actor did something wrong. They're the ones where they did everything exactly right, and in doing so, accidentally handed the audience a window into something deeply personal they never intended to fully reveal. That tension between performing joy and carrying real pain followed Carol Burnett well beyond that single episode. Behind the scenes of her show, she navigated complicated relationships with her co-stars, talked one trusted performer back from quitting entirely during a rough stretch, and built a working chemistry with another so spontaneous that some of the show's most legendary unscripted laughing fits happened live, in front of the cameras, completely by accident. There was a now famous bit involving a meandering, completely improvised story about a circus elephant that one of her co-stars refused to ever rehearse in advance, saving every twist and tangent for the live taping itself, just to catch his fellow performers off guard. Watching the footage decades later, you can see the exact moment the entire cast loses the fight to stay in character, breaking into real, helpless laughter that had nothing to do with the script and everything to do with genuine surprise. That willingness to let real, unscripted human itty bleed through the format, whether it was joy or grief, was part of what made the show feel alive in a way few programs before or since ever managed. Off-camera, her personal life carried its own weight. 2 marriages that ultimately ended. A very public, very costly legal battle against a tabloid that printed a false story about her, a fight she pursued less for money and more to protect her name. And hardest of all, watching her teenage daughter struggle with serious addiction for years, a fight that nearly tore the family apart before it eventually brought them closer than ever, right up until that same daughter's heartbreakingly early death decades later. Through all of it, Carol Burnett kept working, kept performing, kept finding new rooms to walk into well into her 80s and 90s. She stunned a new generation of viewers with a quietly chilling guest role on one of the most acclaimed dramas of the streaming era, playing a sharp, perceptive woman who slowly uncovers a dangerous lie hiding in plain sight. She picked up an Emmy nomination for a comedy role in her 90s, becoming the oldest woman ever nominated in that category, decades after she first stepped into a television studio as a nervous young performer with nothing to lose. The range she's shown across more than 70 years in the spotlight is almost unmatched in entertainment history. And maybe that's exactly why this 1977 episode still means something different than the rest of her enormous body of work. Carol Burnett spent the better part of a century making the world laugh, often by transforming real pain, her own and other people's, into something audiences could survive together. That's an extraordinary gift, but it's also a strange kind of labor, constantly reaching into your own history to make something difficult feel light enough for everyone else to carry. For one single half hour in February of 1977, the laughter stopped, the mask came off completely, and audiences got to see exactly how much true craft, and how much true cost, had been hiding underneath the comedy all along. So here's the question worth sitting with. When a performer spends their whole career turning personal pain into something the rest of us get to laugh at, what do we actually owe them in return? Maybe it's simply this, recognizing that behind every laugh she ever gave us, there was a little girl who once stole toilet paper from a movie theater bathroom just to get by, and who never really stopped carrying that girl with her, even after she became one of the most beloved entertainers in American history. If you enjoyed this look behind one of television's most unforgettable moments, do us a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more people. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one, share it with someone who grew up watching her, and let us know in the comments which Carol Burnett moment has stuck with you the longest. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.